Today I'd like to talk about affirmative consent laws and what I think are some of the fundamental problems with these laws as they're written and just in general that they just will not be able to get around. To date, I think it's California that is the only state that has actually passed an affirmative consent law, but it has been introduced in a few other states. I'll put those in the description. And like I said, there are just some fundamental problems with affirmative consent laws that really must be addressed. I've got a lot written for this video, so I will be looking down a lot. I apologize. On August 28th, 2014, California passed a bill which required colleges to adopt an affirmative consent model for defining and addressing sexual assaults and rapes on campuses in order for these colleges to receive state funding, which pretty much means they have to abide by this. These types of laws, affirmative consent laws, are also called yes means yes laws, and in California's version of this law, affirmative consent is legally defined as affirmative, conscious, and voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity. It is the responsibility of each person involved in the sexual activity to ensure that he or she has the affirmative consent of the other or others to engage in the sexual activity. Lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent, nor does silence mean consent. Affirmative consent must be ongoing throughout a sexual activity and can be revoked at any time. The existence of a dating relationship between the persons involved, or the fact of past sexual relations between them, should never by itself be assumed to be an indicator of consent. Now, this sounds like a very good idea, and for individuals on a case-by-case, me-to-you basis, this is absolutely what you should do. It is very important to know what your partner or partners want in a sexual encounter. The basic idea of this law is a noble one and a good one, but writing these ideas into law is not a good idea, and I say that for four main reasons. Number one, affirmative consent laws remove the presumption of innocence and reverse the burden of proof. Number two, affirmative consent laws demand an unreasonably low standard of evidence for colleges. Number three, affirmative consent laws outlaw many consensual sexual encounters. Number four, people give ambiguous signals about sex, and what actually happened is often unclear. So, first point, affirmative consent laws remove the presumption of innocence and reverse the burden of proof. They do this by requiring the accused to prove that the encounter was consensual, instead of requiring the accuser to prove the encounter was not consensual. In other words, the person accused would have to prove that they were innocent, and if they couldn't, they'd be punished simply because someone pointed a finger at them. But don't take my word for it. Take it straight from the co-author of the California bill. When bill co-author Assemblymember Bonnie Lowenthal was asked how an innocent person is to prove he or she indeed received consent, Lowenthal said, "Your guess is as good as mine. I think it's a legal issue. Like any legal issue, that goes to court." She doesn't dispute the fact that innocent people will have to prove their innocence, and indeed she goes on to say it's not really her job to care. I mean, put simply, she was asked, hey, if someone were falsely accused, how would they get out of that? Is there any recourse for them? And she said, I don't know, let's find out. Another woman by the name of Susan Dwyer, an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Maryland, wrote an essay defending affirmative consent laws, and in her essay she says, "The change shifts the burden of proof from the accuser, who had to show that she resisted, to the accused, who must now show that he sought and received her consent." Essentially, affirmative consent laws require colleges to classify all sexual encounters as rapes by default until it can be proven otherwise, and because of this, falsely accused people will become falsely convicted people, unless, of course, they happened to videotape the entire encounter. And even then, I suspect the accuser would appeal to some kind of traumatic hysteria or coping mechanism to explain away any appearance of consent in the video footage if it existed. Yeah, I know it looks like she was enjoying herself, but that's just a coping mechanism for the trauma she was going through. Yeah, I know Mattress Girl sent her rapist messages of love afterward, but that just proves how traumatized she was. Now, let me be perfectly clear on this. I'm not saying that these kinds of traumatic coping mechanisms are fake or that Stockholm Syndrome is not real, but I would like to point out that if you bring them up in the context of affirmative consent laws, they seal off the last avenue of escape for someone who was falsely accused. Any sort of appearance of consent, any evidence that the person did consent, could be explained away as a traumatic coping mechanism, so you'd be screwed. However, I'm not only concerned for the college students who will be wrongly punished, I'm also concerned that this may become the stepping stone for affirmative consent laws to become the law, which would be a huge violation of human rights, the complete reversal of innocent until proven guilty in these situations. Indeed, several feminist writers have argued for this exact kind of shift. Always believe the victim in a legal setting and reverse the burden of proof, including Jessica Valenti, who says, Swedish rape laws go much further than US laws do, and we should look to them as a potential model for our own legislation. In fact, some activists and legal experts in Sweden want to change the law so that the burden of proof is on the accused. The alleged rapist would have to show that he got consent, instead of the victim having to prove that she didn't give it. The writer of another feminist blog, who says, the bottom line is that nobody bears the burden of convincing you their rape really happened. It is beyond noxious to think that as second or third parties we could sit back and judge the veracity of those claims, or that we should. When someone speaks about their experiences, we listen. Period. Now these are just some top picks. If you go to Google and type in words like rape, burden of proof, feminism, you'll find a whole host of people who really do want to reverse the burden of proof in these situations. Point number 2. Affirmative consent laws demand an unreasonably low standard of evidence for colleges. California's affirmative consent law requires that colleges adopt the preponderance of evidence standard for adjudicating sexual misconduct and rape claims, which is satisfied when the judge believes that one side is even slightly more likely than the other. In evaluating sexual misconduct claims, Senate Bill 967 calls for schools to apply a preponderance of evidence standard similar to Title IX. It's a lower standard of proof used in civil cases instead of the beyond a reasonable doubt bar used in criminal trials. Just to give you an idea of how lax this standard of evidence is, it's the same standard of evidence that governments use in civil court cases, which deal with things like contract disputes and parking tickets. This stands in stark contrast to the standard used in criminal cases called beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a much higher standard and which is only prudent when the consequences of guilt are so high. But by all means, go ahead and let colleges expel students with a scarlet R on their forehead using the same standard that settles contract disputes and negotiates parking tickets. Now I should make this clear, colleges are not courts and they cannot send convicted students to jail. However, expulsion as a sex offender or rapist can bar these students from higher education simply because no other college will take them. And even after college, imagine trying to explain to your future employers why you got kicked out of college. Well, I was convicted as a rapist. Yeah, see if they want to hire you. This deserves a higher standard of evidence than what is used to settle contract disputes and negotiate parking tickets. Point number 3. Affirmative consent laws outlaw many consensual sexual activities. You there. Yes, you. Do you enjoy bondage or other sexual activities that require a safe word? Well, that's too bad, because remember, lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent. Just because they haven't said the safe word, that doesn't mean they consent to what you're doing. So if you enjoy these types of normal, consensual sexual activities, congratulations! Under affirmative consent laws, you are now a rapist. Number 4. People give ambiguous signals, and what actually happened is often unclear. This is probably the most important point I'd like to make in this video. The fact is that consent is not always black and white. It is often a delicate spectrum, and affirmative consent laws go wrong by classifying too much of that spectrum as pure rape. But why do I say this? Where am I getting this from? Well, at the Amazing Meeting, or TAM 2014, a woman named Dr. Carol Tavris gave a talk called Who's Lying? Who's Self-Justifying?, in which she discusses awkward sexual encounters in a college setting, link in the description. In her talk, she explains how these situations arise, and in doing so, she explains why the affirmative consent model is a horrible way to deal with them. She even goes so far as to specifically lampoon the state of California for proposing it. Her talk is linked in the video description below, along with the time intervals where she makes important points about sexual encounters. Specifically, people say no to mean many different things, even to indicate consent. People do a dance of ambiguity to spare each other's feelings. A common signal of consent and of non-consent is not doing anything. Some women drink alcohol to create plausible deniability about their consent in case someone accuses them of being a slut. In other words, they intentionally blur the line. Cognitive dissonance can create false memories about sexual encounters. Dr. Tavris specifically denounces affirmative consent laws for the above reasons. On a related note, and forgive me for getting slightly off topic, you might remember a while ago that people were complaining that the song Blurred Lines promotes rape culture by saying it's okay to assume that a woman wants sex if you do. However, I think that if that song means anything, it's explaining Tavris's exact thoughts on the subject of sexual encounters. It's saying, hey, it's okay to want sex. Drop this good girl routine, be honest about your sexual advances, and stop creating all these gray areas for me to interpret or misinterpret, and just do what you want to do instead of beating around the bush. But like I said, this is a little off topic. More recently, and more on topic, a woman wrote an article explaining how she found herself in this kind of awkward, semi-consensual sexual encounter, which fits perfectly with Tavris's general description, and which is hardly comparable to rape. It's just what happens to young, sexually active people who are unsure of what they want or what they are getting into. Link in the description. So as we've seen, affirmative consent laws reverse the burden of proof, they lower the standard of evidence, they outlaw some consensual sexual activities, and they fail to understand how sexual encounters play out in a college setting. The solution for dealing with these awkward, quasi-consensual gray areas is to become aware of the things Tavris noted that we naturally want to do, such as create plausible deniability for ourselves or spare each other's feelings, not to legally require people to act differently. Just because an action is a good idea for individuals to perform, that doesn't mean it's a good action to require by law. The same could be said of not cheating on your spouse or bystander intervention. While there are good ways for individuals to deal with these situations, it is very clear that these situations would not benefit from having legal force, just as affirmative consent laws will not benefit sexually active people.